Hi everyone, my name is Emily Coder, and I was the mentoring author on this project, Cross-Modal Examinations of Narrative Structural Processing in Autistic Individuals. The overall background of this project is that we are looking at how people understand the structure of a story, like the narrative arc of a story, when stories are told either through written sentences or through pictures, like in comics. So we're looking at, does understanding narrative structure differ between written stories and comic stories? And is autistic traits, does autistic traits modulate understanding structure? And the background here is that there has been some evidence in the field that understanding the structure of sentences or of stories told through pictures has been shown to be a little bit different in some autistic individuals. But those two modalities, written stories and picture stories, have never really been directly compared before. So we presented participants with stories that either had kind of a traditional narrative structure. So that's the top example of the stories here. So according to kind of narrative grammar theories, every story starts with establishing information. So like the first few sentences or the first few panels kind of introduce the characters and set up the action. Then you get initial panels or sentences, and these are sentences or panels that kind of initiate the action, right? Something happens to these people. Then you get a peak, it's like the climax of the story or the height of the narrative action, and then there is a release, so like the story kind of wraps up. So that's the traditional narrative structure that were present in the quote normal narratives that we presented. And then we mixed things up. So we manipulated whether the stories had structure or not. So in the structural only stories that we showed people, we maintained each sentence or each panel at those same positions, right? So the first few panels or the first few sentences were establishing information, and then there was an initial, and then there was a peak sentence or panel, and then releases. But there was no meaning between the sentences or between the panels. So you couldn't really create a coherent story out of things. There was still this narrative grammar, narrative arc, but there was no meaning between the sentences to link them into a coherent story. And then we totally scrambled things up and presented stories that had no meaning between the panels, and there was no structure to things. And so we used EEG, we used measures of brain activity to see if people differed in how they were understanding the structure of the stories in each of these two modalities. And overall, what we found is that autistic traits did modulate people's understanding of narrative structure. So in general, in both the comics and in the written stories, we found that higher levels of autistic traits were associated with bigger differences between the totally scrambled up stories and the ones that only had narrative structure. And what this suggests is that maybe people who have higher levels of autistic traits might be using different strategies for understanding narrative grammar or narrative structure than people who had lower levels of autistic traits. So this is a really important thing to look at just in the context of this idea of the visual ease assumption, and suggests that because we're seeing similar differences between autistic and non-autistic individuals, or between higher and lower levels of autistic traits across both written and comic modalities, it suggests that there's a kind of an overall difference in structural processing and narrative structural processing that doesn't seem to be tied to one modality or another. Thank you so much for your attention and for listening.